So I think we've gotten most of us on the call. And I'll be joined by Jeff, who's my husband and also business partner. He's finishing up another call because today was one of those mornings where we have Zoom calls back to back to back. But today we're going to talk about just sort of Legislature 101, how to be heard. And before we get started, I wanted just everybody to introduce themselves and just your name and your organization that you're with. And then if you can give me an idea of whether you have testified before the legislature before or what sort of level of involvement you have had, so we can get a better sense of whether to skip really quickly through the basics or spend more time there. So I'm Nikki Reading. I have covered as a reporter the state legislatures in Oregon and Washington, and then worked for both the News Tribune covering state government and politics, and then went to TVW, which if you're not aware of TVW, it's like C-SPAN, but for the state of Washington. So covers every legislative hearing and committee. And so that was my crash course in state government. Jeff, who will be joining us shortly, started working for the state legislature and worked in the Senate as the communications director, and then transitioned to consulting and helping people navigate the, the not easy to navigate legislature. So I would love to just go around and hear your name and organization and whether you've testified before, or whether this is all new for you. And I suppose since we can't go around in a circle.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm Kimi Irene Gitt. I'm the director for Vibrant Schools Tacoma. And I have not formally made testimony in front of the larger entity of our legislator, but one of the things that I think skill set that I have is I have met individually in their offices as an advocate, because I think sometimes that one-to-one intentional dialogue that they can take to the General Assembly is an effective way, but I've never officially testified in the larger group, but have been very with due diligence, have those one-on-ones in their office. And then those that are willing to meet in the community at a Starbucks and have chit chat with me, I've done that and initiated that to say how we as an organization feel about eradicating the educational disparities for our students of color and those impacted by poverty. So that's the only link that I've had to legislators.
Excellent, thank you, that's great. We'll be talking about those one-on-one meetings and they are very important. So I'm glad that you have experience doing that. Does anybody want to go next? I can just call on people since we can't really go in a circle. So Lee, is Lee on the call?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you. I testified for a hearing once for an apprenticeship program, and I have done some in-office meetings with legislators, but not a lot. So
great, thank you. Leandra.
I think Leandra posted in the chat. She's on another call right now, but
okay, great. Thank you.
Not giving testimony, but she's attended lobby day with a group of youth.
Great. Thank you. I did not see that. Susie.
Good morning. Susie Diaz. Have not testified before the large audience at all, but very comfortable talking with legislators and electeds overall.
Great, thank you. Salman, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yep. Hi everyone, my name is Salman. I've worked with Bomber Group. I'm a senior advocacy manager over here. And I have not testified before legislators before, but I've worked on campaigns and led campaigns where we've prepped speakers to testify before legislators before, and I've met some individually, as Kimmy was describing.
Great, thank you. Wendy?
Good morning, I'm Wendy Holcomb. I work with the Foundation for Tacoma Students as a post-secondary access coordinator. And I had my first crash course in both testifying before the legislature last spring, and then also meeting one-on-one during a lobby day, advocacy day for Graduate Tacoma with individual legislators. So, yep.
Great. Sarah, do you want to talk?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Sarah Detweiler with the Foundation for Tacoma Students. And I have not testified, but I actually worked this past legislative session as a committee assistant in the Senate. So I got to hear lots of testimony. So yeah, I feel like even though I haven't done it, I have learned a few things just from watching.
Yes. Did I get everyone? I'm just looking at a list here. Did anybody not get a chance to? Oh, Shema, you didn't get a chance to speak. Do you want to?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Shema with the foundation. I haven't personally testified, but I have been in the same room with Wendy while we were speaking to legislators during our Graduate Tacoma Advocacy Day last year.
Excellent. Did I leave anyone out?
I will just share.
Oh, geez.
No, I am going to be in listen-only mode, but I feel like I can answer this question because although I have testified in front of legislatures in California, Texas, Tennessee, Colorado, and South Carolina, and then now Washington, it's still terrifying every time. I shake a little, and I have to take deep breaths, and I have to really focus on my hands so I don't shake while I'm talking, and it's very intimidating. The whole structure, you're down low, they're up high, so I can always use prep because I am not naturally comfortable with the structure. And even if I think I'm going to be, I show up and then it just isn't the most comfortable place in the world.
Yeah. We're actually going to talk about that. And I'm gonna start sharing the screen here so you all can see the presentation. But I think one of the key points that April brought up is that it's absolutely not designed for comfort. It's designed to be grand. And so these buildings were not. This is the Senate chambers in the Washington State Senate, and it doesn't scream "everyone is welcome here." It's grand. It's big. You can see these. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you can see these sort of church pew looking things up here. That's where the public is allowed to sit, and down here is where individual legislators sit at their desks and get ready to debate bills, and it's all incredibly formal and formalized, and absolutely was not built with the idea to be welcoming. It was built to be grand, and grand is naturally intimidating to most people that I know. And so how do you sort of navigate that as somebody who wants to advocate for people who are vulnerable? And so that requires us to sort of step in and become familiar with this. So we need to break through the grandiosity and figure out, what our place is. And I think that for most people, and it doesn't mean that you're not nervous, but the whole process of testifying is like everything there. It can be kind of mystifying. It can be very formal. It can be intimidating for all those reasons. And so a lot of people don't think of themselves as someone who can or should or wants to or feels like testifying. But I think that for most people I've talked to, it's kind of like riding a bike. Once you do it, it's not quite as intimidating. You have to go through the process of signing in and then waiting in that room. And so I think the great news for all of us is this year it's going to be much different because of the global pandemic. And that's a good thing. I think that for advocates, this is the year that you should get as many people as possible comfortable with the process. And the reason is the bar has not been lower in a good way for being able to testify. So typically, you've got. I'm gonna skip to my slide on sort of the typical. Sorry, guys. We'll get there later. So typically what would happen is you go and you sign in, and then you go in the packed room that some of you have been in, and you wait and you wait and you wait. and you listen to everybody else, and then you don't know when you're going to get called, and finally they call you up, and then you're looking, as April said, up at a panel of people, and then they give you like 60 seconds, maybe 120 seconds to do your testimony, especially on the bills that have a lot of people signed in. So this year, things are going to be done a lot more remotely. And that means that you don't have to take a day off of work to drive to Olympia. It means that you don't have to, go and listen to the people who are paid to do this professionally. You might just get to schedule a Zoom hearing. And so that, of course, is going to present some additional, it's going to be an interesting year for trying to advocate. But I think it also presents a lot of opportunities. So we're going to talk about how to do that this year, and knowing that none of us know what the legislative session is going to look like. So we're going to assume that there's going to be some option for remote involvement, but we don't know yet exactly how that will look. So I just first want to do like a very quick primer, and it sounds like most of you know all of this, but it can be the stuff that nobody tells you that takes a while to figure out. So our state legislature is comprised of the House and the Senate, and the House has its own committees, and each of those committees is comprised of members. And so there might be a public safety committee, and that committee would hold hearings on bills that are related to public safety, or a K-12 and public education committee. They in the House and Senate, they have slightly different names, but not every single bill gets a hearing. And depending on a number of factors, a bill can have many hearings. So each hearing is a chance to have your voice be officially on the record. I think in addition to all of the gold-plated grandiosity that really exists in every state capitol, they like to do these complex calendars to try to keep themselves on track. And so, they'll say, this is the committee cutoff date, and this is the, we'll talk a little bit more about the House of Origin cutoff date. There's all these elaborate calendars. But I think what's important to know, and what Graduate Tacoma knows very well, is that any bill can be revived, gutted, changed, tinkered with right up until the very end. And I'm referencing 2 sessions ago when the bill to fix the fix on the fix for McCleary decision and levy funding was dead, and then it was deemed to be dead, and then I think in literally the 11th hour right before adjournment they revived it and passed it. And so it's good. I think it's good to just be aware that it's kind of a wild process, and they try to give themselves deadlines and dates, but it's you don't. I think what you do not need to be an expert on the process. That's there's plenty of people in Olympia who are process experts, and that's not the role that you need to play. But it can be intimidating, so I wanted to specifically call it out. So I think process-heavy institutions absolutely love acronyms and special terminology that can feel even more exclusive. So just quickly, most of you probably know representative, or rep, is shortened. That's a member of the House. Senator, or sen, is a member of the Senate. The Ways and Means Committee is my favorite. That's just a fancy way of saying the people who write the budget. And cutoff, we talked about earlier. There's a series of cutoff dates that sound vaguely like Game of Thrones. House of Origin cutoff. And so when a bill is not voted out of committee by that cutoff date, they call it dead. But as we already talked about, nothing's really ever dead. When you're talking about a floor vote, that's simply when the entire House or Senate chamber debates and votes on a bill. And then one that you'll hear as you get closer and closer toward the end of session is NTIB, necessary to implement the budget, which is policy-only bills have an earlier cutoff date than bills that are deemed to be NTIB. But people who have been around for a while will tell you that absolutely any bill can be NTIB if the legislator whose vote is needed says it's so. And that's, I think, April will probably agree, that is how the fix to the fix got passed 2 years ago, is that when a block of Tacoma legislators says, good luck passing the budget if you don't have our vote, big thumbs up from April, good luck passing a budget if you don't have our vote, we'll sit here until you get it done, then that's suddenly it's necessary to implement the budget. So that's all sort of the background, trying to take the pieces apart of, you know, this sort of complex legislative structure. But really, the legislature is a group of citizens that have been elected. These are not, legislators are not experts. We have a citizen legislature. That means that they are part-time. They, you know, they may work full-time on these issues, and certainly during session they're working overtime, but they are regular people. They're not, they're doing their best. And so the way that you can be heard is to connect with those citizen legislators in a way that is helpful and solutions oriented. And so we're going to talk about, you know, sort of exactly how to do that. I want to just pause for a moment, because I know that after sort of hearing everybody's experience level, I kind of went quickly through those first few slides. Does anyone have any questions or comments before we sort of pivot into things like framing our message? All right. I don't hear you, so I'm going to keep going ahead. So how can you be heard? The first step, and one that often gets forgotten, is framing your message. And I'm going to talk more about each of these steps. Framing your message means that you create a vision for your audience of what this change would mean, how it connects to real people, and why it's important. Step 2 is deliver that message every chance you get. Not different messages depending on the day and the time, but delivering that message, those key messages, over and over in the appropriate channels. Step 3 is building working relationships. And as Kimi mentioned right at the outset, you know, she said, I've not testified, but I have built those working relationships. That is every bit as important, and, you know, more important overall than going and testifying on one bill one time. So again, with citizen legislators, they are relying on their, you know, voices in their community and voices of experts to help them navigate, you know, very complex issues. And so if you imagine any of us getting suddenly elected to serve as a legislator, well, suddenly, you know, most often legislators are passionate about a couple of, you know, really causes that are important to their district. And then they get elected, and suddenly you're voting on land use policy, you're voting on, you know, healthcare and health insurance, and incredibly complex and bills full of minutia about workers' compensation programs and retrospective rating. And so that can be, I think it's good to stop sometimes and think about, what is it like to be a legislator, and how can I help that person? And so, you know, we really think the way that you help the most is building those relationships and developing that rapport and trust. And then step 4, sending a thank you and being, you know, thanking the legislator for their work if they've stood up for you on an issue. And I will say that's also a step that most people forget. So we're going to jump into, how do you frame a message? So lawmakers hear some of the same phrases over and over, especially when budgets are tight. And this year they're going to have to make cuts. And what they hear is, shame on you, hundreds of times in hearings. Shame on you. You're hurting this group. You're after the, you know, the recession of 2008, for several years after that, they had very tough budget years and had to make a lot of cuts. And over every year they would hear, if you do this, you will kill people. And if you can imagine being, somebody who got into public service wanting to help, and you're not, legislators are not paid highly for their time. And they get there, and what they hear is shame on you. It's making it personal. And you are going to kill my grandma or my relative or you're going to negatively impact my student. And that's, I have a lot of empathy for legislators. That's, they came into the business to help. And those kind of messages make them feel, really terrible. And that's not our end goal. Our end goal is to enact policy that's positive, and is best for the people who we represent. So if you want to be heard, you want to show up with solutions and real examples and statistics whenever possible, and a willingness to work together. So the most effective people, they show up and they can tell you how many students would be impacted by this, or how many children would be impacted by this policy. What would it cost to fix it? And what are some ideas for how to do that? And so when you're framing your message, framing it in a way where you're showing up with a solution baked in, or some number of solutions, is the best possible way to develop your reputation as a reputable, trustworthy advocate who can provide that context for legislators. Because on any given issue, one of their biggest points of focus at all times is, what is it that the people in my district want? What is it that the people in my district need? And so if you can show up with some ways to answer that, that increases your chance of being heard. And then always connect policy to people, and people to the process. And I think I can say that, jump up and down and say that as many times as possible, because these policies are often, you read the bill report, you read the legal language, and there's no people in there. There's language that looks like and was in fact written by a lawyer, to be as precise and specific as possible. And so when you can connect those words to real people in the legislator's district, and then connect real people to the legislative process, then you increase absolutely your ability to get your message across to legislators. So I'm going to just take a minute and open it up again to if anybody has questions about how that process works. And then also, I don't know if you can see us or just see the screen, but Jeff is now joining us. So say hello to Jeff.
Good morning, all.
So does anybody have questions about the framing?
Hey, Nikki, I guess it's not, I guess it's a question, because I really appreciate that you gave us the reality of what we'd be walking into this next session, which will be different than it's been in the last couple of years. Yep. What is a way to, because I very much agree that saying shame on you, you're bad, it goes counter to what elected officials like to be liked. They're people pleasers, right? By nature, most of the time. So what is a way to position, though, if you are going up to testify against a bill, if you're going up to explain why a bill would, because like most of the time, to be honest, we've gone up and testified pro bills. Mm-hmm. Or at least that's been my experience with our organization. So if there are cuts happening or a policy that's going to be passed that we think is detrimental, what's a way to be polite but firm? Yes. In testifying against?
Yes, that's a great question. And that's absolutely going to be part of what this year means is we see a bill to cut a program or cut an entire budget line, and you're going to need to make a statement. And I think one of the things is that legislators think of and structure things in terms of investments. And so when they are adding a program, adding a line of funding for K-12 schools, that's a long-term investment. And so if you think about being committed to a long-term strategy to, say, increase graduation rates or reduce disparities in, educational quality and access for students across the state, then you can frame it in that way as well. So we've made an investment, and we decided to make an investment as a state in, say, increasing graduation rates. and it's worked. And that investment, and another way is to position it as how that funding in the past has impacted those graduation rates. So, you know, with $1 million of funding for every, you know, we've been able to increase graduation rates by X%. And if that goes away, then we are, you know, then we are putting ourselves back on the path to right back where we started. And so if we want to continue to improve graduation rates, we have to find a way to continue offering this service. And I think part of it is, it's sort of like, you know, conflict resolution principles, to, rather than focusing on a position, focus on the interest. So the interest is increasing graduation rates, which has a whole host of downstream impacts that are all uniformly positive on the individual students, the city, the community, and the state's economy. And so the interest is in preserving graduation rates, even in a tough budget situation. The position is don't cut the funding. But if we approach it as an interest and then align those interests with legislators, because no, you know, when those, you know, the shame on you or you are hurting, that is aligning their interests with, with evil or negligence or incompetence. And I think we want to recognize that their interests are similar to ours and they're having to make a lot of tough decisions. And I see a lot of people say that. I know that you have to make tough decisions, and just acknowledging it can be very powerful. And then looking for an alignment of interest rather than arguing over positions. And I think that's one of the most effective ways, because you're acknowledging that the other person doesn't have you know, horrible intent in cutting this program, but that they have a horrible decision to make. Do you have anything to add on that?
I think that's all very well taken and correct. Just friendly additions include always offering yourself up as a resource, because you know, legislators want to be part of the solution. They want to help you, but they are also spending most of their time during session hearing other people's need for help and need for them to come up with solutions, and they are welcoming of anybody who wants to help them do their job better, who wants to bring solutions or resources or new ways of thinking to the task at hand. And in terms of the question of position versus interest, in a cutting environment, legislators, you know, frankly, want to do, I mean, not no harm, because you can't in a dramatic economic restructuring like we're facing, but they want to minimize the harm, and they want to minimize the harm in terms of populations affected, and they want to minimize the harm in terms of long-term impacts of that harm. And so, yes, there will be cuts, and that's going to be unavoidable. But if you can help provide context for cuts that minimize the inequitably harmed or have been historically inequitably harmed, that's always an important case to make. And if you can offer context for how the outcome of the cuts or the outcome of a solution does not carry long-term generational effects, does not carry you know, downstream effects for a long period of time that will take, you know, the next 10, 15, 20 years to correct. And frankly, you know, the whole McCleary discussion that, you know, the state has spent 6, 7, 8 years having was a result of the last economic recession we were on. So that's how long it took us to even feel like we've come to a spot where we addressed harm caused back in 2008. And now here we are again. And so the decisions that lawmakers are going to make need to take in the long term into account. And one thing I'll say is, in any budget conversation, the budget legislators are going to be thinking about bow wave effects. And when they think about bow wave effects, they're thinking about, well, if we add this spending here, what does that mean in the out years? What does that mean 2, 4, 6 years from now to the budget? If we're locking in this level of spending, are we creating future deficits down the road? Are we creating a bow wave down the road? And that's just in terms of numbers. But I think you can also make a same argument about bow wave in terms of outcomes to affected populations. And so if you cut this program now, 2, 4, 6, 8 years down the road, you're getting magnified, ramified impacts that become costlier to address, and the harm that is caused and the costs that are associated with that are not just financial, but they're social, they're personal, they're community-based. And so giving that context can be helpful, and it can be done in a way that shows your alignment with the desire to find a solution that minimizes harm, rather than trying to shame and advocate for only your position only.
The other thing I'll say is, I think you can hear in even the way that Jeff was framing it up, that it quickly gets far, far away from actual people. We're talking about bow wave, we're talking about, big numbers and 2, 4, and 6 year projections. And so that's why that last line, connecting policy to real people, saying this will impact graduation rates is one thing. Bringing someone who graduated because of this program and who would not have graduated without it is another thing. And those personal examples are extremely powerful to lawmakers, and also helps them do their job, because what happens is they hear about it in the public hearing, and then they go into caucus, which is another great vocabulary word, which just means the group of legislators. So House Republicans have a caucus; they meet together in private. House Democrats have theirs, Senate Republicans and Senate Democrats. So one legislator goes into the caucus room and they hash these things out. And that's when, if a legislator says, I know the impact of this, and I know what this is going to do for my district, and I've talked to students who this would impact, and that allows them to be more prepared, and that's sort of the perspective that we're coming from. And then the one other thing that I want to say is, I think what's really important to call out in terms of a difference between the Washington State Legislature and Washington, D.C., is that Washington, D.C. can print money, and they can run a deficit. Two things that we can't do. The state of Washington has an entire department that is tasked with forecasting the state's incoming revenues, and they release the revenue forecast on a quarterly basis. And the legislature must budget to the forecast. So if the revenue forecast says, with historic unemployment, we have people who have fewer means. And in the state of Washington, since we have a sales tax, when you have less money to spend, when you have less money in your pocket, you have less money to spend, and then the state gets less sales tax. And so our budget is highly dependent on sales tax. And when people are spending less money, we generate less sales tax. And it doesn't matter if we like the number that the economists come up with for the forecast is what they must budget to. And so if they say you have to cut, that's where you hear these numbers. We have a $4 billion shortfall or a $6 billion shortfall. It's completely projected numbers based on what they think that we might get in tax revenue. And so that's important to note, because at the federal level, they could create a program with no real way to fund it, and pass it, and sort of fudge the numbers a little bit or run a larger deficit. We can't do that in the state of Washington. And so if there's an $8 billion shortfall that's projected for the 2-year budget cycle, they have to budget to that. And so it really does force them to make excruciating decisions. And I think that's a preview of where we will be this year. And so it's very important to find the people in the community who will be impacted by a policy change in either direction, and involve them in the process. And as I said earlier, and we'll talk a little bit more, this is really the perfect time to involve as many people as possible, and help turn people into advocates. So we're going to do just a quick reflection, and we may not have time to share each of these, but if we can take a minute and just reflect on your organization And if you know any issues or policies that you might support or advocate against in this upcoming legislative session, and then just some ways to frame that with a solution and a human voice. So we'll just take a minute, and I think I would just encourage you to, if your organization is not having the discussion in those terms quite yet, that now is the time to do that, because none of us know exactly what the legislative session is going to look like on any given sort of plane of reality, but we do know that it's going to be a year where there are cuts. And so having an idea of how you can frame that with a solution and humans who are impacted by that policy is a discussion to absolutely begin now organizationally. And then as you're reflecting on that, if anyone has questions, or if something wasn't clear, or if we just brought up something that does not make sense, please don't hesitate to jump in and ask a question.
I have a quick question. What's the best resource to use, or where should folks go to look to understand what might be included on a legislative agenda for a given session? So if we have a set of issues that we care about, how do we know whether that will be discussed, or who's leading the charge and who we need to talk to as we conduct this legislative advocacy?
That's a great question. And I wish that I could give you a very simple answer, but just like the institution is not necessarily built to be welcoming and easy to understand and easy to follow, I think it's the same thing with issues. So, I mean, there's the leg.wa.gov, so leg.wa.gov is the legislature's page, and there is an absolute ton of information there on individual committees, on what they've considered in the past. You can search for bills by keyword, so you could search the keyword childcare. One of the problems is that there is so much information that it can become overwhelming. So I think for any of you who have not been on that website, I would say just set aside some time to just explore and see what's on there. And then each of your legislators will probably, throughout the course of, the legislator who represents your district, will be interviewed, or will make statements, or will put on their site their legislative priorities. And so you can get a sense for, I'm in Representative Jeannie Darnielle's district, and she cares deeply about the following issues. And so there's areas where I might connect with her. And so that's one way to do it. And we're going to talk more about the relationship building aspect. And it sounds like, I think Jeff has some other.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can send out some really specific links that can make this a lot simpler than maybe, although definitely encourage you to check out the legislature's page. So the way that the calendar typically works is that in December, the governor releases his budget for the year, and the budget is a policy document. Yes, it's a budget proposal, but it shows you his priorities, the issues that he wants to work with the legislature on, and that is a starting point that gives you a sense of kind of the scope of conversation that you could generally expect will happen in the legislature that year. Similarly, I would look to and going to the governor's website now can start to give you some insight into what those issues are, what his thinking is, how that might, how those issues might shape up in the legislative arena. Secondly, I would look to the majority caucus websites. So the Democrats are the majority in both the House and the Senate. So the House Democrats, because they're in the majority caucus, they determine the flow of legislation. They sit and run all the committees. They determine which bills get heard, get moved through the process, get heard on the floor, and exchanged over to the other side of the chamber. Similarly, the Senate Democrats do the same on their side of the rotunda. And so looking at each of those caucuses' legislative agendas and priorities, which they will, they are developing now and probably will update their website between now and certainly any anticipated special session that we'll have in November, but then also between November and January, you'll start to get a sense of the caucus's priorities. This is what the caucus thinks that the legislature should be talking about, issues that the legislature should tackle. So we'll send you links to both of those, all three of those places for you to kind of comb through. And then at the beginning of the legislature, the week before the legislature begins, there is what's called the AP Forum. And that's when the AP hosts a public conversation with the head of all four of the caucuses, the House Republicans, the House Democrats, the Senate Republicans, and the Senate Democrats, and says, hey, you're all together. This is your opportunity to tell the public where you think the conversation should go, where you think the legislature should be weighing in and pulling policy levers. And you'll get an opportunity at that point to hear any alignment that exists between the House Democratic leadership and the Senate Democratic leadership. And if there's alignment on issues, then you know that those are big important issues that are going to pass the legislature. But then you also get to hear areas of disalignment between the two and hear the minority party's view on what the majority thinks should be the case. And so then you get to hear Republicans offer their counter thinking and maybe counter solutions for the public to consider. And that's just a really valuable way to kick off the session and understand what will be priorities for the legislature moving forward. That's all to say that legislators respond to their constituents. So even when you hear and see all of these priorities, that doesn't mean that if your community or your organization or your stakeholder universe has something that's not reflected there, that it's not, that you won't have the opportunity to make your priority a priority for legislators.
And the AP Forum is really a great example of a time when I would say just go and, we'll send the links around for this in our follow-up, but, TVW will air the entire thing unedited. If you read the news stories the next day, you'll see, each reporter will focus on whatever they can get into 500 to 800 words. But if you take, a couple hours and watch it, you can really see, as Jeff noted, what are the priorities? What are reporters asking about? What are areas that are total blind spots? And then what are the parties who are not in power, which in this year is the Senate and House Republicans, but how are they arguing against or arguing in support of their own? And it's just sort of a look at how everyone's framing things. And as advocates who are working in the field every day, you might find yourself spotting holes in their arguments or just areas where they need more understanding. And so that's a really good opportunity to help shape, your outreach plan. Does that answer your question, Salman?
That was excellent. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So does anybody else have any questions before we jump to the next?
Hey, Nikki,
Okay.
it's
Yeah.
Isabel. You might not be able to answer this, but you just triggered a thought in my head of another place and I gotta be honest, I missed out on it last year because I was out, but on maternity leave. But what about committee days?
Yes.
In the fall? What do they offer constituents? What are they? What do they offer constituents? And then what are they I heard a rumor that they will look very different this year. Do you have any idea of what that is?
Yeah, committee days are an opportunity for the legislature to convene for 2 or 3 days in the fall in a typical year. We're not in a typical year, obviously, but it's an opportunity for legislators, again, citizen legislators returning from their normal day jobs to have a check-in back in Olympia in their roles as legislators, to hear from advocates, to hear from lobbyists, to hear from members of the public about, and it's basically an information gathering session for shaping the agenda for the legislative session in January. And so typically you'll see work sessions held. This is not an opportunity for bills to be run or legislation to be passed, but it's an opportunity for workshops to be held, for people to weigh in on concepts, to provide resources, to provide input, and community reaction to general concepts. This year, that is going to be complicated by social distancing requirements, quite obviously, and so will likely be virtual if proceeding. But also, I think they will have to make the call if and whether they go into a special session, whether it makes sense to also have committee days that would happen roughly around the same time period. Committee days happen either in September or October or November. And so if there is a special session after the election, that just might obviate the need to have that kind of convening. But that's the call of the leadership. And frankly, the Senate can do its own committee days, irrespective of what the House decides to do. They typically find time to do them simultaneously. But that's the purpose of committee days, more of like a listening session for legislators in advance of the upcoming session.
Does that answer your question, April?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to talk about, I've lost my cursor. There we go. Delivering your message every chance you get. And we've talked a lot about those public hearings, but that's just one part of the entire sort of a strategy. So each of these items is a tactic, and if you can put them all together and sort of make sure that you're having touch points with legislators all along the way, then you're moving toward a strategy. So a public hearing is certainly, you want to participate if possible on bills and issues that you care about. It's a way to make sure that your voice is part of the public record. Letters and emails to your legislators, those work. I would say avoid a form if you can. If you can't, that's okay, but there are real people who are answering and receiving those emails, who are on the staff. And it's part of their, part of each legislator has staffers who work for them. And it's part of their job to sort through the emails and make sure that the legislators know what their constituents are talking about and approaching them about. And so those are and can be extremely effective. Lobbying days and scheduled visits, and that is going to look so much different this year, but those are a chance to bring in people who are maybe not yet identifying themselves as advocates, people who are in your universe, either people impacted by the policies or people who you serve through your organizations, and to help them see themselves as advocates and help demystify the process for them. And then leave behinds. In a normal year, that would be a one-page physical printout, and I'll make a note about the paperless part, but something that you would literally leave with them to summarize the points that you've made. And basically, if they haven't taken notes, you're leaving them with notes. As we experienced last year, many legislators prioritize paperless exchanges. So paper leave behind would sometimes be returned. But you can offer a leave behind in the form of a follow-up email with a thank you for the meeting and just summarizing your main points and really repeating the messaging of what's important for your organization and the people you serve. And then social media. And I think in years past, social media has been a very powerful motivating force to get people involved, and you can design, very quick things that people can sign on to. And this year it's going to be even more important because we likely won't be meeting in, packed committee hearing rooms. So social media can be a great way to help spread the word and get your message across.
And on that last point, I know you discussed sort of the accessibility of the legislature this year before I was able to join you, and how it is actually in the current moment now more accessible than ever to advocates and individuals than in previous years that require physical presence in Olympia. I think that's a great thing to acknowledge and remember and leverage. And I think the way that that can be done in particular is via social media, because when you have legislative proceedings and hearings and testimony and interactions between individuals and legislators, all done online, all done through video, all done in an shareable way, the proliferation of potential content to support your message as an advocate will be incredible. And I think for those who follow legislative conversations or policy conversations in the state, you're going to see a lot more legislators' words shared on social media, because the accessibility and the availability of that shareable content is going to be right there, at your fingertips. And so the social media landscape, I think in January and throughout the beginning of the year, as we move through the legislative session, is going to look remarkably different. The advocacy landscape is going to look remarkably different, and it's all going to play out on social media. And legislators are going to have to adapt to that in a really quick way, because they are going to be on record, although they always are on record, but on record and in public view like never before. And I think this is just a tremendous opportunity for advocates to use that to their advantage.
I think the other thing that I'll add in each of these things is, we went over some of the vocabulary and some of the sort of process and procedure and acronyms. And I've even heard us say many of them, in the rotunda and and I think what I see and what I've seen a lot of is that language is inscrutable. It's not easy to understand, and it turns people away. And so what happens is, once we start to understand the language, often we start using it without realizing it. And then as we're telling, real people and sending out email messages to people we want, to become advocates, we're often using this language that they don't understand. And so I think it's just an important point to call out that this process wasn't built with user engagement in mind. It's not a user interface that I think anyone would design from scratch in the year 2020. It was, put together piece by piece over many, many years. And the vocabulary is not meant to be widely understood. It's meant to communicate something technical quickly. And so one of the things that I think that where each of us can really be, help people to see themselves as somebody who can be involved in this complex process, is to just keep demystifying it. Use simple language, and use words that people understand. And sometimes the test that I use when I write something is, if I wouldn't say it in conversation, then I don't include it in my writing. And that can be a way to sort of help edit yourself if you're sending out something that the people you work with might not be able to connect with. Because that's really at the heart of all this, is recognizing that the legislature is creating complex policies that affect every single person in the state. And what we need to do through our messaging is connect real people to those policies. So testifying in a public hearing, we've talked quite a bit about this, but it's, a public hearing is held by the committee. So, we talked about the Senate will have committees, and they're run by the party who has the majority of members. And so right now in the Senate and in the House, that's Democrats. So each committee has a committee chairperson, and that chairperson is chosen by the Democratic Party, because they are the committee, or they are the party that has the most members. And those chair people decide which bills to consider. So that's how many bills don't end up getting a hearing at all, because there are thousands of bills and they simply don't have time or interest in bringing all of them up. So tvw.org is your best friend because every single hearing is available on tvw.org. They have cameras and audio in every single hearing room. And you know, this year will be different, but TVW will have all of those hearings, and you can look for hearings from previous years, and you can search them on the website. And so that's when you're testifying. Obviously, typically these are done in person. This year it'll be, you know, maybe remote and virtual, but the reason that we want to really call out why that's important, that this virtual thing, is that every hearing that you see, the first people to testify are always lobbyists. And the reason is they're always there. They're in the hallways, they are hanging out. They have a cafe that they call Ulcer Gulch. They are there, and when there's a bill, they go and they stand in line and they make sure that they are signed in so that they can represent the interests of their clients. And that's great if you have a lobbyist, but not, regular people don't employ a lobbyist. And so I think that one of the most interesting aspects of this year, where things will be more virtual, is if they decide to do where you can sign up for a spot on Zoom to virtually testify, well, that might be that might not favor the people who are paid to be there. That might favor the people who are able to sign up online. And so we don't know what that'll look like, but I think that that's important to just start thinking about. Because it does, change is, our best friend and our worst enemy. Change can be destabilizing, but change can also open up new opportunities. And I really believe that this year there will be new opportunities to get more and more people involved. And that's a good thing for all of us. So in a normal year, you show up, you sign in, you wait in that packed room for your name to be called. You're surrounded by a ton of lobbyists who have been there and will be there forever, and they seem to know everything, and it can be very intimidating. And then once you finally get called up, you're in front of a room full of people, and you typically get 2 minutes, and when they are in a rush, you might get less than that. And for as disappointing as that is for people who have taken off a whole entire day to get to Olympia, and they're testifying about something that they care deeply about, it's also very hard on the legislators who know that that's what people are facing. And so I think I'm excited for what this year brings, just in terms of getting more voices, and voices of people who might not have had the time to physically travel to Olympia in the past. So this year, some things that may look different: online sign-in, Zoom or other remote, options to participate in a public hearing, not waiting nervously in a packed room. But also, with the budget outlook that we're facing, this means more people will want to testify and more people will be able to. And I think we have to realize that there's typically so much noise in between, to get your message heard. You're dealing with a lot of interference, and in this year, there's going to be more voices, and the potential downside is more, sort of interference, more noise. But the potential upside is if you can get a lot of people to share how the policy is impacting them, then it's actually a wonderful opportunity to bring more people along in this process. So we really think that this is the year to connect policy to the people and people to the process. And I think some of the key ways to do that are to communicate with your however you want to, stakeholders, constituents, or the people you serve, to let them know. And often there's pretty short notice. You might find out that a bill is going to get a hearing the next day. And so establishing now some lines of communication, whether that's on Instagram and Facebook, or whether that's through an email to people who have signed up for your communications list, but letting them know, here's what we're planning to advocate for or against, here's how we might need your help, and helping them to understand how they can start to get prepared for being involved. And I also just want to say, I really do think that once people get, cross over into seeing themselves as an advocate, I have testified before, I have met with my legislator, then getting them to re-engage is easier. And so I think this year, if we really focus on bringing in as many people to the process as we can, then in subsequent years, because, as Jeff said, this isn't going to be a one-year thing where we deal with all the horrifying, COVID fallout and then move on. This is going to be a multi-year process. And so this is a great time to help grow advocates in your organization. So I know we revisited this on purpose. Typically, it's a big push to get just a few people at a public hearing. It's a big push to get just a couple people to send an email. It's, April and Shema can tell you that scheduling, group lobbying days and visits is an absolute ton of work. But doing one of these things or doing them sort of in a haphazard fashion is not nearly as effective as doing them in concert. And it takes a bit of work, but I think thinking of it in terms of these various buckets that you can help organize around, and might help generate volunteers or people who would be interested in helping lead each of those charges. And
I'm not sure if Nikki already mentioned this earlier, but the decisions that are made by legislators don't happen in a theater of the legislature. They happen over the course of months.
What's the next slide?
Okay.
Is previewing the next slide. So the next part of it is building working relationships. And I wanted to switch the slide over, but go ahead and continue what you were saying, because I think this is really critically important to how people approach the work.
Sure. And from the perspective of your behavioral model as advocates, viewing advocacy is not the same as casting your vote. There should never be a point up until your policy or bill is voted on by the legislators where you wear a sticker that says I advocated. It's not the same thing because it's much more of a process. And if you attend a public hearing, that's great. If you testify in a public hearing, that's great. If you send a letter, that's great. But you have to be in it for the long haul, for the long engagement. And the reason for that is that you're interacting with citizen legislators. They're not full-time legislators. They don't do this for their livelihoods. Most of them, they mostly have other things that are their real lives back in their real districts. And so part of their role, their behavior model is putting up their antenna and trying to make sense of all the messages coming their way and getting the best sense that they can read on what their district needs and what their district wants. And the only way that they can do that is by making sense of the messages coming their way. And so if you're part of a bandwidth that can give them credible information, that can give them accurate information, that can give them a sense of scale and scope and urgency and broad base of support for a position, then the legislators can make a decision that is gonna closely align with where you're coming from, because their ultimate goal is not to, for the most part, be committed to an ideology or a position, but to reflect their district, and they do that in a careful balancing act sort of way. One of the sort of more glib phrases that we always like to try out at this point is, a legislator really is sort of in the business of saying, show me where my people are going and I will lead them there. But the real point is that they're fact finding, they're gathering information, trying to get a sense of where their district is, because there's no place that you can go that says this is where your district is. They have to determine that themselves. And the way that they determine that is by hearing from you. And so that's why advocacy works, because advocacy gives them a sense of the importance of an issue, the urgency of an issue, the scope of those affected, and the solutions that can be brought to bear on the issue. And so establishing that relationship early on and on an ongoing basis, not just showing up for, testifying in a public hearing or writing a letter and being done with it, is the key to being part of that surround sound that the legislator can make sense of.
Yeah, I mean, I think if each of the legislators had a budget to do polling in their district and really have a sense of where their constituents were at, I think they would spend millions of dollars doing polling because they really do struggle to hear what is, and they want to hear how this is impacting their district specifically, and of course the state as a whole. But as an example, if you're dealing with something like graduation rates, talking about the graduation rates of the state is obviously a powerful number and statistic. Talking about how this impacts their community and the schools and the students and the teachers and parents who they represent, again, allows them to say, for my community, for my constituents, this is either good policy or not good policy. And so I think this is an opportunity to sort of cultivate a relationship with legislators. They need trusted supporters and advisors who they can rely on for accurate information, because they have a lot of people coming to them with problems, with maybe inaccurate information, with incomplete information, and with a position, but not commonly aligned interests. And so if you can show that you're willing and able to help brainstorm solutions, to help find people who are connected to the policy, those are great ways to make yourself very helpful to and develop that working relationship with the legislator.
And one sort of corollary point to that is that legislators don't make decisions based on the most rational argument, the best, most persuasive case, the most irrefutable logic. It's not a debating society, and that can come as a surprise to some people, or that could be a complete non-shocker to some people. But legislators, I mean, ultimately their interest is in keeping their jobs as legislators, and that's not a thing to denigrate them. We're all of our primary interests are keeping our jobs. But the way that they do that is, and the way that you can appeal to their interest, is by understanding that the way that they keep their jobs is by reflecting the interests of their constituents, and reflecting the interests of their district. And so if you can engage them in that way, as we just described, rather than a irrefutable knockdown, logically airtight case, then that's going to open up the kind of relationship and the kind of conversation that is not only valuable to them, but is valuable to you.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's another, just talking about interests rather than positions. They have to take positions. They have to make votes. And sometimes their votes are based on something that is a downstream impact, or something that isn't top of mind for most people. And so it's important to note that you can and should develop relationships, not just with the legislators in the majority party, not just with the legislators who agree and align with all of your interests and positions, but with the legislators who don't. And there may be a legislator who is on the complete opposite side of the political spectrum from where you are at, but if you can approach them in terms of talking about interests, and a shared interest toward, healthy schools that are providing high quality public education. I don't know anybody who's not interested in that. We have different positions on it, but approaching even people who you disagree with and trying to find some common solutions is a much more productive path than being someone who has a position and a stake in the ground and won't talk about other options. Somebody have a question?
Yeah, very quick question that kind of covers, I think, both steps 2 and 3, which is assuming, obviously showing up in as many places as possible and having your organization and your message heard is ideal, but given limited resources and time, is there a certain place that you've seen that's most effective in showing up with legislators? Or, if we had to choose one of the list of places to show up, what should we prioritize, if there is one?
That's a great question. I mean, I think I can't pick one. That would be, I wish, but I think it's really important and something that you can do now to develop those relationships, because most legislators are probably holding some form of virtual outreach meetings. And if they're not, I think most people would be surprised how willing they are to do it. And so, if you have a group of even, a half dozen people who would be willing to do a virtual coffee chat with a legislator, I would actually be really surprised if they would not agree to that. And so that can be a way to just familiarize yourself with the legislator, to start developing that working relationship, and get a sense of what their questions are and help provide the answers. Because it would be great if they all had, a staff of 10 who could do independent research, but they often have one intern who's there part-time answering phones, one staff member, and that's what they've got to, to sort of field the incoming flood of requests during the session. So I would say if I could pick one right now, it would be to start that outreach and develop some of those working relationships. And then during session, I would, during session is not a time to develop relationships. They are often working, 14-hour days, 18-hour days. They might be there until 2 in the morning and then show right back up at 8 in the morning. And so there's not a lot of time for relationship building. But that's a time to sort of activate your advocates. So start the letter writing and the email campaign and discussing it on social media to either generate support or help bolster support while those policies are being considered. Does that answer your question?
Yep, that's great.
Okay, all right. So step 4, I wouldn't put this in a slide if it was common. Lawmakers and their staff members just people don't thank them routinely. And they are accessible, even though they only have a very small staff. They are working, basically around the clock, and really with a community service mindset, and constituent service oriented. And yet very few people stop to thank them. And I think one of the best tips is that the staff members of each of, in each of these offices are often early career professionals who they are in meetings, they know what's going on, they know schedules, and they sort of are often overlooked. And so it's developing a rapport with the staff members. They might then alert you when an important bill is coming up, or they might let you know if a last minute hearing has been scheduled. And those are very important. And so just make sure that you're following up with a note of appreciation, and that can go a very, very long way in establishing those working relationships. And the other thing is, the people who work in Olympia, whether they start out as an intern or they're a committee staff person, they often stay there. And so many of the people who I interviewed 10 or 12 years ago are now, one is the code revisor for the state of Washington, somebody who was a committee staff person 12 years ago. She is now responsible for maintaining all of the revised code for the state of Washington and has an entire staff. And so it's absolutely worth it to just take a moment to connect and express, appreciation. So I'm gonna close that so we can have a brief discussion My computer has been overwhelmed with the amount of slideshows that I've made recently. So, so we've got about 10 minutes, and I think this is just a time, and I can finally see the chat window. So I apologize if anybody had a question, but please, if you have, questions or something didn't make sense, or you want some specific input on issues that your organization is facing, please feel free to pepper us with questions.
I'd like to just make a comment. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. Good information. One of the things that Vibrant Schools Tacoma is about through its advocacy is a little more localized. And one of the things that we are going to be initiating are workshops to help parents, students, community people be able to make testimony at school board meetings. But I see some very generic pieces of this that we can carry over. So I'm so appreciative of that, because it's helping me as I'm sort of structuring how's that's going to look workshop wise. How are we going to help local folks at a school level to be their own advocates. One thing I can say is at least the school board gives us 3 minutes. I can't believe it's 2 minutes.
Sometimes it's 90 seconds.
I was shocked when you said 120 seconds. I was, holy shit. I'm sorry. But it's like, my gosh, but do you really have to be precise? So that 3 minutes just sounded wonderful to me, that we're helping people to formulate, sound information, messaging, et cetera, in 3 minute time frame. So I would change to state. But one of the things I'd like to say is, and especially to Wendy and April, if you want Vibrant Schools to be part of a coalition to go down, please let me know. If we're going down to do the things on a much larger basis. But I just wanted to say how much generically this is very beneficial to our organization as we launch our workshops for students, parents, and community people to be good advocates and make testimony at school board meetings.
That's a great call out. And I think something that we meant to sort of call out right in the beginning is that, the legislature is built this way. It's this, complex, but most even anything that's quasi-governmental is usually structured in a pretty similar way. There's hearings, there's decision makers, there's decisions. And so it is, generally applicable. And so I'm glad that was helpful.
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Does anybody else have questions? As you are thinking of questions, I will say one other thing. My sort of favorite quick go-to way for structuring anytime you're in a public speaking or presentation like testifying is really like it's a quick and dirty way of structuring it. So you think of just your three best reasons, and then you put those in a sentence, and then you just then take a minute to talk about each one, or 30 seconds, and use a supporting fact whenever possible. Or if a supporting fact isn't possible, then a personal example of a real person who's impacted. And then you sum it up and conclude. And so for those of us who get nervous when we're in front of, a panel of legislators and everyone's staring at us, just remembering that, like, you can really count it, like introduction, each of my 3 points, conclusion, and you can do it, in your lap while you're, and it can, because a lot of people who we work with say, like, I wrote out my testimony and then I got up there and then I forgot all of it. And I'm not even sure what I said because I just blacked out. And then I came away and I'm not even going to watch it because I don't want to see what just happened. And so that's that like counting on your fingers is my best tip.
Sadly, I have been there where you're
I think we all have.
And I refuse to watch the video because I don't think it was good. One thing I would add to that, though, that I also learned, maybe not like in the best way, but now I very much know, is I think Jeff and Nikki have mentioned a few times, and I need to remind myself of this, we are not supposed to be experts for the legislator. We are supposed to be supportive of them, and specifically supportive of the ones who maybe agree with whatever we're asking for, and get them information and personal examples. But we're no way supposed to be an expert of law, policy, funding, or even how the state works. And I only bring this up because I have been in a situation where and it was the opponent who, or the opposite side of the position, who after I gave a testimony, much like Nikki said, they responded with like questions that I would not have known the answer to. And that I haven't seen that happen in Washington a lot, actually. It happened a ton in the Tennessee state legislature, but in Washington, everyone does feel to be a bit more friendly about, letting citizens come speak and then just saying thank you and then moving on. But even if you do get a question, you shouldn't have to know the answer. And so my go-to response is, I don't know if I'm prepared to answer that today, but I will get back to you for more information. Or I think this is what I'm going to say today, but I will follow up with your office with a detailed response later today or tomorrow. And I just would actually encourage someone, even if you think you know the answer, maybe always do that, because in the moment of the stress, you might say something that you didn't mean to, especially when we're talking about something that might be highly charged.
Yes, that's an excellent point. And April, you're absolutely right that in Washington, it is generally part of the etiquette that when a citizen is testifying, that they will not get, grilled in the same way that an expert would. And so there are, you will see in hearings that if it's, say, I'm a senator and it's my bill, I might, it's a public health bill, I might get a public health expert to present in that first panel, and they might get 10 minutes instead of 2. And those people will often get the difficult questions. But the best phrase to remember in any of these instances is, I will get that information for you, some version of that. And you'll hear people, if you listen to enough TVW, you'll hear people say it all the time. Even people who are experts, they will say, I will get you that information. I don't have it with me right now. Or I will find this statistic and send it to your, office. So that's a great call out, April.
And I thought of it even more for Kimi for the school board, because, there's just, I think even at a local level, people will come and ask for things. You'll go with an ask of the board, and you could get questioned of like, well, how would that ask work? And to be honest, that's not your job as an advocate. That's actually the school board's job and the school staff's job. But it's a tactic that electeds will use at every level if they maybe don't like it, or, whatever the reason is. So I just always encourage people that if you get questioned at any level, always try to defer to give yourself more time to formulate an answer later on. That because the last thing an advocate, and you know what, I'll be honest, even though this is being recorded, shame on like electeds sometimes for not, just being polite to advocates. But the reality is when an advocate's going and arguing against their position, they might use that tactic to try to make you look less credible. So taking a breath and saying, I'll come back to you with that information is probably a safer bet than like trying to off the cuff answer.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And the other thing that I'll add is, it is, I've probably, I think I've watched thousands of hours of hearings because I worked at TVW for long enough and had it on constantly. So things like people being nervous, that's it's absolutely normal. Most citizens who are coming to testify do get nervous. It is always less apparent to everyone else. Some of us get like the actual like splotchiness right here. If that happens when you get nervous, I'd say wear a turtleneck and just roll with it. And just know that the legislators, they realize that this is an intimidating process. And so no one is judging you or tying your credibility with your ability to present, without getting nervous. They see it so often that it's just not something that they will say, oh, we'll never let that lady testify again because she got, she turned a little flustered. It's just people recognize that, and you'll find that they are very friendly and accommodating. any other questions or comments or things, we will be sending out the follow-up. So we'll send a couple of pieces. We'll send the resources that we talked about so that you're not having to quickly scribble down URLs as we're chatting. We'll send an assessment where you can just sort of let us know what worked and what didn't work. And also please include any follow-up questions that you have, and we'll be more than happy to follow up. And that can include questions about your individual priorities as an organization and just like brainstorming. We're definitely happy to help with that. And then we'll be sending out the resources and then the assessment. And for the assessment, I always say, please be as honest as possible about what was helpful and not helpful, because the way that we can make sure that these are worth everyone's time is getting really honest feedback. So thank you all for your time here, and we'll send out the follow-up in the next day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really, really informative and super helpful. I have to jump off for another call, but I just really, this was great. Thank you so much, and April, for setting this up.
Shema.
Oh, Shema, thank you. Thank you, Shema.
Thank you all for attending. And I don't know if we said this in the beginning, but this will be one of 4 in a series that we will do different topics from now through December. And we will also, this is being recorded. I hope we said that in the beginning. I don't know if we did. And then we will post it to our YouTube channel. So if you want to share the video for other folks to listen to the content, it will be available probably next week. Right, Shane? Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much. Great information. Good seeing everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Take care, all.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.